today's seminar, we have read two books. One was written in the 4th century BC by Aristotle, a student of Plato, and himself one of the greatest philosophers of all times. The other was written in the 18th century by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a great French philosopher. Both of the books we have read, Aristotle's Politics and Rousseau's Social Contract, are great books in political philosophy. We have not read the entire book in either case, only the first 7 chapters of Book 1 of the Politics, and only the first 8 chapters of Book 1 of the Social Contract. I chose those brief sections as the readings for this seminar because in them the same fundamental questions are faced. Questions about the nature and origin of the state, about the end and purpose served by the state, about the basic distinction that divides all forms of government into 2 kinds, and about slavery. With these questions in mind, our chief interest in the first part of this seminar will be to discover whether on each of the questions mentioned, Aristotle and Rousseau agree or disagree. I would like to open this seminar, as I opened our seminar about Plato, by asking you some questions to which I would like you to give the answers by a show of hands later. 1, do Aristotle and Rousseau agree or disagree about the nature and origin of the state? Second question, do Aristotle and Rousseau agree or disagree about the end or purpose served by the state? Third question, do they agree or disagree about the basic distinction that divides all forms of government into 2 kinds? And finally, do Aristotle and Rousseau agree or disagree about slavery? Now, let me go to that first question and explain it a little bit before you answer it, because if I could restate the question as follows. Does Aristotle say that the state is natural or conventional or both natural and conventional? Look at the diagram. The word natural has 2 meanings. See, N1 and N2, there are 2 different meanings of natural. In the first meaning of natural, a beehive is a natural society. Bees are gregarious animals, and the kind of hive a given species of bee forms is the same generation after generation. It's formed instinctively. What the bees do to create the beehive is an innate instinct in that species of bee. Similarly with an ant mound. An ant mound is an instinctive society, formed always the same way, generation after generation, for a given species of ant. Compare those 2 natural societies, produced by nature, produced by natural instincts, innately with which the members of the species are endowed. Consider the difference between that kind of natural society and a purely conventional society, like the American Medical Association or a Rotary Club. Men come together and voluntarily form the American Medical Association for the purposes of advancing health, let's say, in the United States. Or men come together and form a club, like a Rotary Club. They write a kind of a bylaws for it, a constitution for it, create that club for a given purpose, let's say charitable purposes. Those are purely conventional. But there's another meaning of natural, which I haven't told you about, which is in the text, which makes it possible for a society to be both natural in the sense too, and conventional. How many of you think that on this question, whether the state is natural, 3 alternatives, conventional, or both natural and conventional, how many of you think that Aristotle and Rousseau agree? How many of you are, not absolutely certain, but with some assurance, able to say you think they disagree? Would I have those hands, please? The others can remain silent for the moment. I'll go over to you, Alan. You say they disagree.
Yes.
To do that, and whether you all can follow this, and you're right, you'll agree with him. If you think he's wrong, you'll have to point out why he's wrong. You read the text first in Aristotle. You must first tell me, since they disagree, which way do they answer the question? How does Aristotle answer the question?
Aristotle says that the state is a natural convention.
And you've got a text to show that.
Right.
Will you call your classmates' attention to the text?
Second page, second paragraph, actually the third.
On page?
Page 446.
Right, would you read it, please?
And therefore, if the earlier forms of society, meaning family, are natural, so is the state, for it is the end of them, and the nature of a thing is its end.
That seems like a perfectly flat statement that the state is natural. It is not, is it not? Are there anyone else here see any other text on that same page that support what Alan just said? Yes, Sheila.
It says further the state is by nature clearly prior to the family and to individuals. All is necessary prior to the part.
Any other text that seems to support Alan? Yes?
It says, hence it is evident that the state is a creation of nature.
The state is a creation of nature. There are three texts there. Now then, Alan, now what you have to do is to read a text of Rousseau that shows, what answer does Rousseau give?
I think Rousseau said it was based on convention. He said it outright at one point, but I couldn't find that. But I did find some things.
Tim, do you want to help Alan?
Yeah, on page 389, first paragraph under slavery. Rousseau says, since no man has a natural authority over his fellow and force creates no right, we must conclude that conventions form the basis of all legitimate authority among men.
Yeah, that's one text, yes?
Aristotle says that the earlier form, they both agree that the earliest form of society is a family. And he argues that the family is maintained by nature. But here on page 388, the bottom of 387, or actually at the top of 388, it says the family itself is then maintained only by convention.
Well, why don't you, since you read the end of that paragraph, read the beginning of the paragraph, the opening sentence. Are you going to do that, Sheila?
The most ancient of all societies and the only one that is natural.
Oh, yes, that is important. And the only one that is natural. Now, since the family is not the state, he wouldn't say that if both the state and the family were natural, he wouldn't say the family is the only society that is natural, correct?
Right.
That supports Alan, doesn't it not? Are you all convinced by Alan, with the text read, that Aristotle says the state is natural, and that while Rousseau thinks the family is natural, he thinks it's the only society which is natural, and therefore the state is not a natural society, but formed by convention, supported by a text that Tim read. Do you all think that Alan has made the point perfectly clear?
Yes.
All? No discussion, no difference of opinion at all. Well, I think Alan's wrong. Now, there are other texts. Can anyone find a text that shows, let me take Aristotle first, that shows that maybe Aristotle thinks the state is both natural and conventional, but natural in sense N2, not sense N1. Can anyone find a text in Aristotle that suggests that the state is conventional as well as natural? Yes, Tim.
A social instinct is implanted
Yes,
in all
that's
men
the
by
text.
nature.
Read it out loud. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful.
A social instinct is implanted in all men by nature, and yet he who first founded the state was the greatest of benefactors.
Listen to those words. Yet he who first
It's
founded...
right above where it begins.
It's at line 30,
Yeah.
in the right-hand column of page 446. See it? And yet, let me just read that language. A social impulse. Men are like bees and ants. Men are gregarious, like wolves and lions and elephants who herd together. Men are gregarious, but they are not instinctive. The word instinct is, I think, a bad translation there. Social impulse is implanted in all men by nature. They're impelled by their nature to being gregarious animals to associate with one another. But, then he adds, yet he who first founded the state, yet he who first founded the state was the greatest of benefactors. Well, if no individual bee founded the beehive, no individual ant founded the ant mound, he's saying a man, a human being, we ought to praise the human being who first founded the state. That must mean it came into being, the state came into being some other way than by a creation of nature, because a human individual did something about it. What, have you any guess at all, you might not know this, but if you don't, I'll be glad to tell you, who Aristotle might have had in mind when he said he who first founded the state was the greatest of benefactors? Any guess? Have you ever heard the names of Solon and Lycurgus? No.
Yes. Yeah, I've heard.
Solon and Lycurgus were Greeks in about the 7th century BC. Solon wrote a constitution which created the city-state of Athens. Lycurgus wrote a constitution which created, actually brought into being, a constitution which created the city-state of Sparta. And it's those two individuals, Solon and Lycurgus, that Aristotle had in mind when he said these men founded a state. Now, can you find the text which indicates that other meaning of natural, which makes it possible for Aristotle to say that the state is both natural in sense too and conventional because a man founded it? Can you find that text?
When several villages are united in a single complete community, large enough to be nearly or quite self-sufficing, the state comes into existence, originating in the bare needs of life, and continuing in existence for the sake of a good life.
What in that sentence indicates a different meaning of natural? Yes?
Well, it says that it says originating in the bare needs of life.
Yes.
So it's natural and that the people group
Have needs.
together because they have needs.
Right.
But then they continue to be together because they want a good life.
That's right. In other words,
Better.
the other meaning of natural, that's very good indeed, Laura, it's a very, very, very astute insight on your part. The other meaning of natural is something is natural if it satisfies a natural need. If human beings, the first meaning of natural is an inborn instinct, an innate instinct. Bees have that instinct, the ants and termites and wasps and so forth. But men don't have an instinct, and think of the reason now. If men had a social instinct, all human societies, all human families would be the same. But the anthropologists teach us very clearly that across the globe, there are many, many different forms of family organization. Not for given one species, we're all one species, but a wide variety of families and a wide variety of tribes and a wide variety of states, which would not be the case if the state were instinctively natural, see? But if these forms of society are all originate naturally because they answer to a natural need that men must, suppose men didn't have families. What is the need for the family? What is the basic need for the family?
Survival.
Survival, yes. Would the human infant survive without a family? No. The human infant, one of the things about man is that the human infant needs a family in order to survive. There are some animals that do not need their elders. When they're born, they're left set adrift. In the case of the human infant, without a family, the human race would not survive. So we have a basic natural need there for the family. Who else said that they thought Aristotle and Rousseau agreed?
We disagree.
Disagreed. You think they disagree?
Yes, I
right?
think they disagree.
Now you have to now show that Rousseau disagrees with Aristotle, don't you? You now see that Aristotle is saying, Tom, that the state is both natural and conventional. If Rousseau disagrees with Aristotle, Rousseau must be saying either that it's purely conventional or purely natural. And you think it's purely, Rousseau says it's purely conventional, don't you?
Rousseau is conventional.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
Anyone else on that? You all think that Tom is right, that Rousseau, now that we see what Aristotle says, do you all think that Rousseau is saying the opposite, that the state is purely conventional? Because as you read the passage, Sheila, he does say in so many words, the most ancient of all societies, and the only one that is natural, is the family. Now you've got to find some other texts that move it in the other direction. Is there any other text in Rousseau that begins to change what Rousseau means, so that we find out whether Aristotle and Rousseau agree or disagree? Any other text in Rousseau? Yes, Jude.
In that same paragraph, it also says, on 388, on the next page, it says, in the family itself is then maintained only by convention.
Mm-hmm. So the family which starts, let's understand.
Natural.
Let's understand. It starts out
It's
because the
conventional.
children need the parents to
Father,
survive.
right.
But when the children grow older and no longer need the parents, then the natural bond between parents and children is dissolved and the family can break up. If it stays together, it stays together voluntary. That's right. So he's saying the family at one stage is natural,
At
and the
another
later stage
stage,
is conventional. Now, how about the state? We now have to see if there's any text in Rousseau that suggests that the state may also be natural as well as conventional. Yes.
I suppose men to have reached the point at which the obstacles in the way of their preservation in the state of nature show their power of resistance to be greater than the resources at the disposal of each individual for his maintenance in that state. That primitive condition can then subsist no longer, and the human race would perish unless it changed its manner of existence.
Now, in that text, there's a phrase that I have to be sure you understand. What Rousseau means by the state of nature is a condition in which each man fends for himself, as if there were, there's a hypothesis that Rousseau has in mind, men living in isolation, not even in families. And he's saying, just as he says that the family is needed to preserve the race, isn't he saying here that the state is needed to preserve? The state is needed also to mislead the state of nature and form a civil society in order to preserve the human race. In which case, aren't Aristotle and Rousseau agreeing? Both are saying the state is conventional, and both are saying the state is natural in the same sense of natural. The state, like the family, answers a natural need. They differ in only one point. What is the natural need for Aristotle that the state answers?
Good of man.
The good life. What is the natural need for Rousseau that the state answers?
Preservation of life.
Preservation of the species, right?
Right.
So there is a little bit of disagreement. One man, Aristotle thinks the state satisfies the natural need for a good human life. The family keeps us, preserves us. Rousseau says the state is natural in the same sense that family is for the preservation of the race. Correct? But they agree, don't they? One doesn't say, see, they disagree. They would disagree.
They agree in different
Pardon me?
ways. They agree in different ways.
Yes, but not as different as...
Not strongly.
They're both
different
saying
ways.
it's conventional, aren't they? Because Aristotle says the state is founded by a man, and Rousseau says conventions create the state, correct? And they both have the notion that there's a natural need to be satisfied, so that they both are on this line here, N2 and C, both natural and conventional. Right, let's take the second question now. The second question is, do they agree or disagree about the end or purpose served by the state? How many of you think that Aristotle and Rousseau agree about the end or purpose of the state? Let me take you first, Tim. What texts?
Okay, in Aristotle.
What do they think the end or purpose of the state is, positive and negative?
Positive.
Would you read the texts?
Okay, in Aristotle, in the first paragraph,
On page...
the very first page, first paragraph.
First paragraph, first chapter 1, right?
Right.
Read it out loud.
If all communities aim at some good, the state or political community, which is the highest of all, and which embraces all the rest, aims at good in a greater degree than any other, and at the highest good.
Seems like a flat statement that the state has a positive end, right?
Right.
Plus the statement that Laura read over here, namely the state comes into existence for the sake of a good life. Now, would you read me the text in Rousseau that supports your point?
Okay, on the last page of Rousseau, up at the top of the second column, it says that man should be bound to bless continually the happy moment which took him from it forever, his natural state.
I think, for state of nature, yes.
Right, and instead of a stupid and unimaginative animal, made him an intelligent being and a man.
Go ahead. Matter of fact, that's so good. Read the last paragraph as well of that, slowly and clearly.
Okay, we might, over and above all this, add to what man acquires in the civil state, moral liberty, which alone makes him truly master of himself. For the mere impulse of appetite is slavery, while obedience to a law which we prescribe to ourselves is liberty.
In other words, one more passage, the very opening passage of chapter 8.
Passage from the state of nature to the civil state produces a very remarkable change in man by substituting justice for instinct in his conduct and giving his actions the morality they had formerly lacked.
In other words, both Aristotle and Rousseau seem to be saying the state, moving from into the state, confers upon man a great moral benefit. Well, you've done very well with it. I must say, but I really want to stop for a moment, because only if you, those who have any of you who have not spoken, any questions that you want answered, because we've moved fairly fast. What we've done so far is found that on two very important questions where Aristotle and Rousseau at first appear to disagree. If you look at the text carefully, we find that they don't really disagree, but almost completely, not quite completely, agree. Have any of you any questions about that? Any dissent? Because I don't want to go on to the next question. Yes, please.
Okay, I understand the purpose that Aristotle is saying, but I don't quite understand Rousseau's as well.
Well, you didn't understand the text that Tim read. So
Right,
she said,
I don't quite understand.
Aristotle is saying the state comes into existence, serves the purpose of giving man a good or civilized life.
Right, I understand.
And that last paragraph that Tim read on the very end of the social contract, that
We might
what
not.
man acquires by moving into the civil state is moral liberty, which makes him master of himself. Gives him, see, there are two kinds of liberty. The kind of natural liberty you have in a state of nature, unlimited liberty. The other is liberty limited by law and justice, and is moral liberty. And Rousseau is saying that's better, isn't he? Isn't he saying in that paragraph? Sherry?
He's saying that moral liberty?
Is better than natural liberty, yes.
He says that,
Please, go ahead, Tim.
he says that without the state, man is just, in his own words, a stupid and unimaginative animal. And the state makes him an intelligent being in man.
Okay, because he's more cultural.
Yeah. Any other questions? I don't want to go on until you're all sure you understand this.
So what are you saying? That what you're saying right now is right? That the state is for the good of all? Is that what you're saying?
No, I shouldn't be saying it that way. The question was, do Aristotle and Rousseau agree? Are they both saying, all we're asking, we're not saying what is true now, only saying what is what the texts say. Never confuse those questions, because I'm not saying what is true. I'm only trying to see if we can understand what Aristotle and Rousseau are saying.
Okay.
And the question is, are they saying the same thing or different things? And we seem to have found out, William, that they're both saying the state goes beyond the family and the tribe by serving a higher good than just merely daily subsistence, the biological goods we need to live by, mere life. That they give us a good life, a morally good life, a human life, a civilized life. Clear? And I commented on the word civilized comes from the Greek word for civil, Latin word for civil society, civis. Any other question? All right, let's go to now the next question is difficult. Third question is, do Aristotle and Rousseau agree about the basic distinction among the kinds of government? Let me go to the board here now, using the other diagram, and suggest what those basic distinctions might be. The word, letter D, these are all letters, I'll explain the letters, but letter D stands for despotic government. Letter C stands for constitutional government. And that line across the page says, this diagram suggests that the basic distinction between all forms of government, dividing all forms of government into two kinds, is the distinction between despotic government and constitutional government. There are various ways that we say that. Another way of saying it is despotic government is the rule of men by their own power and might. Constitutional government is the rule of law, for a constitution is a body of laws. So there are two forms of despotism: tyrannical despotism, which is the government that masters exercise over slaves, and benevolent despotism, which is the government that parents exercise over very young children or infants. In both cases, it's despotic because the ruled, the governed, are not governed with their own consent, and they have no voice in their own government. The other form of government is constitutional. And in this case, those who are governed are called citizens. The word citizen comes into existence only with the coming into existence of constitutions. Before there are constitutions, there are no citizens. The principal rulers are the citizens, and the instrumental rulers are those citizens who, for a time being, are in public office. Right? Clear? Now, let's look at the text and see if our two great political philosophers are saying the same thing or different things about this. Yes?
Well, in Aristotle on page 448, in the first paragraph, well, it's only one paragraph in the whole side, but
Yep.
about the middle,
Yep.
it says, at all events, we may firstly observe in living creatures both the despotical and constitutional
That's a
rules.
very good text indeed. Go ahead.
So he's recognizing that there is both
A despotic-
despotism and constitutional.
That's a basic statement that these are the two basic kinds of rules, despotical and constitutional. And I'll add one at the very end of the second paragraph, whereas the government of the king
Yeah.
is personal. That means by his own personal power. When it is according to the Constitution or the rules of political science, the citizens rule and are ruled in turn. Then the ruler is called a statesman. That's, again, supports the point. Would you say that government, which is despotical, is government by might, and government, which is constitutional, is government by right, not by might? Is there any passage in Rousseau that suggests the distinction?
Force does not create right.
Read that passage. Tell us where that is.
Page 389.
89. The first paragraph on chapter 4. Read it out loud, Buffy. You're quite right.
Let us then admit that force does not create right and that we are all obliged to obey only legitimate powers.
And as you pointed out, Buffy, Rousseau says force creates no right. Government by might alone is not rightful government, correct? Not legitimate. Force creates no right. So that's, I think, the third point on which Aristotle and Rousseau agree. Now we come to the fourth point. How many think they completely disagree about slavery? How many think they completely agree about slavery? How many think they partly agree and partly disagree? Let me take the... Were you there too, Chris? Mm-hmm. You first, my friend, Todd. You say you're saying they wholly, completely disagree, right? Explain why.
If you look on page 389 of the social contract,
Yeah.
and paragraph 4, and it says slavery, it says, at the beginning, it says, since no man has natural authority over his fellow and force creates no right, we must conclude that conventions form the basis of all legitimate authority among men.
Yeah.
Now, towards the end of that paragraph, it's, well, not towards the end of the paragraph, but in the next paragraph, it says somewhere in the middle, now a man who becomes a slave of another does not give himself. He sells himself, at least for a subsistence. But I thought that it said in Aristotle that it is clear then that some men are by nature free and others slaves, and that for these latter slavery is both expedient and right. So it seems to me that he's saying that some men are born into slavery, and that some men are born to be masters, and then Rousseau says other people sell themselves into slavery so that they may exist.
If I understand, you say the difference between Rousseau and Aristotle is that Aristotle says some men are by nature free, and other men, and by the way, I repeat, the word man means men and women, not male. And some human beings are by nature free, and some human beings are by nature slaves. Whereas Rousseau says there are no natural slaves. That's what you're saying? Chris?
I agree with that completely there, but Aristotle and Rousseau both address two different kinds of slavery.
I see.
Slavery by nature and slavery by law.
Mm-hmm. Slavery by law or convention, either one. Yeah. Yeah. So that's very good point. Very good point, Chris.
Todd said he did the slavery by nature. Aristotle says that slavery is natural.
And Rousseau says?
Rousseau says that it is unnatural, against nature. He said that no man has natural authority over his fellow. And Aristotle says on page 447, at the end of the second paragraph of chapter 5, he says that from the hour of their birth, some are marked out for subjection, others for rule. So he's saying that some are born naturally
In other words,
to be slaves.
Rousseau is saying there is no natural slavery. All slavery is by law or convention, by purchase or conquest, right? And that's wrong. I mean, that slavery that violates man's natural freedom is unjust or wrong. Whereas Aristotle is saying some men are by nature slaves, and therefore to enslave them is not wrong, it's right. Perfectly just to. If a man is by nature a slave, it's perfectly just to enslave him, correct?
That's what they're saying.
And that's what you think they're completely opposite. Chris, there are 2 points. you've made the first point well and clear. Namely, that Rousseau denies that there are natural slaves, and Aristotle asserts that some men are by nature slaves, right? Right. That's a point of disagreement. Now, then the second point you come to is whether or not they agree or disagree about conventional slavery, which is either by purchase or by conquest. What you have to say now is, do they both say it is right? Do they both say it is wrong? Or does one say it is right and the other say it is wrong? Is the question clear, Chris?
Yes. Aristotle says,
Yes.
At the end of chapter 6 on page 449, he says, where the relation of master and slaves between them is natural, they are friends and have a common interest.
Yeah.
But where it rests merely on law and force, the reverse is true.
Therefore, what is he saying? Is he
Slavery by convention is wrong.
wrong? And does Rousseau say that slavery by convention is wrong?
I found a totally opposite part in the text here on page 390 on the right-hand side, the last paragraph. And it says, so from whatever aspect we regard the question, the right of slavery is null and void, not only as being illegitimate, but also because it is absurd and meaningless. The words slave and right contradict each other and are mutually exclusive.
Couldn't be anything flatter than that, could it? If her text is right, that there's never any justification for slavery, even in the case of war, and certainly not by purchase, then Rousseau and Aristotle appear to be agreeing in part and disagreeing in part. They agree that slavery by convention is wrong. Both are saying that. Though Aristotle says some slavery is correct, is just, when the slaves are by nature slaves. And Rousseau is saying that's wrong. There are no human beings who are by nature slaves. So that those of you who seem to said at the beginning they partly agree and partly disagree seem to be correct, right, William?
Right.
Now then, how does Aristotle explain his conception of a man who is by nature a slave? How does he describe? Yes, Buffy.
I think what he's meaning, and he talks a lot about being ruled and ruling, and I think he says that there's people that have to be ruled and there's people that rule, and that men are born by nature to let
rule
other
or be
people
ruled.
Right, but not that I agree with that, but that's basically what he says.
Yes, Laura?
I found a specific text from Aristotle on the first page where he states exactly what a slave and a
Please,
master.
go ahead.
Okay, it's the second column, first
Right.
paragraph.
Very good.
For that which can foresee by the exercise of mind is by nature intended to be lord and master, and that which can by its body give effect to such foresight is a subject, and by nature a slave. Hence master and slave have the same interest.
Yeah. Aristotle is saying some men are by nature slaves, some are by nature free. Rousseau is saying all men are by nature free. Hence Rousseau is saying no man should be a slave. Slavery is always unjust. Aristotle is saying sometimes slavery is just only when those who are enslaved are by nature slaves. Now, Rousseau, there is in his text an extraordinary sentence in which Rousseau explains Aristotle's error. Remember, Rousseau is disagreeing. You got the sentence, Buffy?
Takes the effect for the cause.
Yes, read the sentence. An extraordinary sentence in Rousseau. Out carefully.
You know, I don't know what that means, but I underlined it.
That's wonderful. You found the right sentence, you don't know what it means. Yes?
388 towards the bottom.
Read it.
Aristotle, before any of them, has said that men are by no means equal naturally, but that some are born for slavery and others for dominion. Aristotle was right, but he took the effect for the cause.
Aristotle mistook the effect for the cause. He attributed to nature what should have been attributed to nurture. Those who are nurtured as slaves will appear to be slavish. And then you'll make the mistake of saying they're naturally slaves. Well, you should have said they're nurturally slaves, not naturally slaves. Now, let me ask you, Sheila, would the same thing apply to women in the past? Think of past generations, not your own generation, because women are now nurtured as equals. But if you go back, let's go back even 2 or 3 centuries. Were female children in families brought up differently from male children?
Yes.
And in society and in business? Weren't they nurtured as inferiors?
Right.
And so what is absolutely marvelous insight. The reason why for all the centuries up to the present time, that women were, by all the great philosophers except Plato, I must give him credit for that, I'll come back to that in a moment. There isn't one of the great philosophers of the West who ever said that men and women were equal. All regard, beginning with Aristotle, that women are inferior to men, and by nature. And Rousseau is saying, he's wrong about that too, could be saying it, they only appeared to be inferior because they were nurtured that way. You nurture them.
They didn't know any better.
What?
They didn't know it. I mean, they didn't know any better, right?
They didn't know any better. It's really an extraordinary insight and a wonderful one because it explains how the error is made about male and female as about natural slaves and natural freemen. Nurture is the difference. And so if you nurture human beings equally, they will grow up to appear to have the equality they have. If you nurture some human beings as inferiors, when they grow up, they will appear to have inferiority because they've been nurtured that way, and then you make the great mistake by saying it's their nature. It wasn't their nature, it's their nurture. Is that clear? Let's go to Rousseau. I'd like to see if Aristotle's not the only person who makes contradictions. Is there a contradiction in Rousseau? Let me read you the text that I want you to think about. It's the text on page 391, where he defines the social contract, and he says that the individuals unite with one another, each one uniting himself with all, may still obey himself alone and remain as free as before. In other words, what he's saying is when men, human beings, in that passage on 391 in the right-hand column, when human beings pass from the state of nature, in which they're not living in civil society, and enter into the social contract to live in the state or social, they still obey themselves alone and remain as free as before. Now, that sentence says, even though they become citizens in a republic, they still have complete autonomy. The word autonomy is a word which means complete freedom, obeying yourself alone. Obeying, man may still, even though he lives in the state, obey himself alone. Does Rousseau contradict that anywhere? Yes?
On the last page in the right-hand column, first full paragraph, second sentence says, what man loses by the social contract is his natural liberty and an unlimited right to everything he tries to get and succeeds in getting. What he gains is civil liberty.
That's exactly right. Thank you very much, Tim. It's an extraordinary, simple contradiction. In the passage that Tim just read, Rousseau is saying, when man leaves the state of nature and enters the social contract, he gives up his natural liberty. His natural liberty is autonomy, obeying himself alone. If each of us is not governed, we obey ourselves alone. And the passage Tim read says, when he enters into the civil society by the social contract, he gives up that kind of liberty and gets civil liberty. Hence, when he said that the social contract enables each one to remain as free as he was before, remain as free as he was when he had autonomy or natural liberty, these two passages contradict one another. You all see that. One final question. What you've seen so far is that Aristotle and Rousseau are both Republicans. They're both for constitutional government. They're both Republicans in that small sense, not a large R, not Republican Party in the United States. They are for republics. They regard despotisms as illegitimate or unjust forms of government. Are they also both Democrats? Is either a Democrat? Is neither a Democrat? Is one a Democrat and the other not? What is the difference between a republic and a democracy that enables us to say whether or not Rousseau and Aristotle, in addition to being for republics, were also Democrats? Yes? Still another point? No. Was this country, do you think the United States was founded as a republic and a democracy, or just as a republic and not a democracy? Which do you think is the case?
As a democracy?
What?
As a democracy.
I think it was founded as a democracy. You all agree with
No, I think it's founded as a
what?
republic.
I do too.
You think it was founded as a republic, not as a democracy? Has it become a democracy?
Yes.
Yeah.
What changes? It hasn't become a democracy?
No, I changed that answer.
You think it has become a
I
democracy?
just yelled that out.
What changes have happened in the United States that made it, if that is correct, that it was started out as a republic and became a democracy, has finally become a democracy, what changes have taken place that has made it more and more democratic, yes?
Slavery's been abolished.
Slavery, abolishment of, absolutely, abolition of slavery.
People are more equal.
No, not,
Enfranchisement of women.
let's just take those 2 points. Before the Emancipation Proclamation, before the Civil War amendments, the blacks were treated as an inferior class, not citizens. They were subjects and slaves. They're now citizens, in the full sense of the term. Before the Woman Suffrage Amendment, women were second-class subjects. They were not citizens. Now, do you think Aristotle was a Democrat or just a Republican?
Republican.
Not a Democrat. How do you know? Perfectly obvious he wasn't a Democrat.
Well, because of his view on slavery.
And women also.
Women.
Yeah. What about Rousseau? You
I think
know.
Rousseau was trying to change it to be a
What do you think about it? Is there
Democrat,
anything in
but he wasn't
Rousseau? Is there anything in Rousseau that suggests that he too was not a Democrat, just a Republican, just a person who was for constitutional government, but did not think all human beings should be? One more text to look at before we stop. The footnote on page 392. The footnote is to the word citizen. Read that footnote, and then tell me whether you think I'm right that Rousseau is not a Democrat. What does the footnote say to you? Anyone? Yes? Please.
About the 4 orders of men.
Yes, at the very bottom. He praises his colleague D'Alembert, Monsieur D'Alembert, for saying, in Geneva, there are 4 orders of men of which only 2 are citizens. Well, in any city in which only a small class of persons are citizens, you don't have democracy, is that correct? So that we know that Rousseau's not a Democrat. Thank you very much. I want to begin by saying to you what I said to the youngsters who participated. These are very difficult texts, but they did exactly as well as they could possibly be expected. On anyone, on a first reading of these texts, and since they're so rich and so important, those difficulties are perfectly right. If in the course of the discussion you can get them somewhat resolved, if they leave the session understanding a little bit more than they came in with, you've succeeded. And I think that happened today. It takes, I must say, it takes much more work on the part of the seminar leader than the yesterday's does. Because today, I could not get that without using those diagrams to explain the questions, without every now and then leading them to a text. But if in the course of that, they themselves make the contribution they made, because almost every case, someone had a text that was right on the point. And I said, do you see the point? And they seemed to. I think, in that sense, they'd be congratulated for having succeeded on a very difficult assignment.
That's what struck me, the contrast between today's session and yesterday's. Yesterday, they seemed to revel in the almost the fun of it and the spontaneity. But today, the challenge was so much greater.
That's right.
Because they had to be aware of the structure and the nuance in words, which I think most of them do not know how to do yet.
Well, they were doing it for the first time in their lives, you see.
Right.
Now imagine for a moment, imagine this happening at the end of, let's say, 15 seminars, not at the second seminar, or imagining it happening 2 years from now when they get to college, and they will do much. In fact, I tell you, it takes 5 or 6 goes at this before you really get it, you see.
But I think today they just got a flavor
That's
of what
right.
this was all about. They didn't even expect to have to be able to make those kinds of...
That's correct.
Quite often, you return to logic.
Yeah.
Yet that is an area in which there's almost no formal instruction within the public school, except on a very rare individual basis. How much instruction in logic ought youngsters to receive, and where ought it come from?
I think it ought to happen exactly as I did it, only when it becomes useful to do it. If you gave a course in logic by itself,
yes,
it wouldn't be nearly as effective as teaching the law of contradiction and its meaning in the context of a seminar like this. See? Similarly, in another case, you might make some use of the form of the syllogism as a form of reasoning. When it became relevant, in other words, I think the teaching of logic, as of grammar or of rhetoric, should occur in the context of a seminar, not by itself. But you You should do every opportunity use every opportunity you have to teach logic, grammar, and rhetoric in seminars.
Dr. Adler, today I noticed that after your students had gone through the first two questions, you stopped and said, y'all have done this so well and so fast, I want to make sure that we have no questions. And did I detect a note of surprise, almost that you were not expecting them to cover it that fast, or did you expect that they would cover it fast and that you wanted to take a break before going to the last two?
I think on those first two questions, they did extremely well very quickly. And so quickly that I wanted to be sure that I lost nobody. That's why I said, do you all understand this? Have you any questions? Because at that point, if someone said, no, I haven't followed it, I'd be prepared to spend more time, you see. I think you have to do that. If things go too quickly, you want to slow them up. Because you can assume that everybody is following along at the same speed, and that isn't the case. So that's why I did it that way at that time.
I want to ask you something else specific about what happened in the seminar today. You said at the beginning that you wanted to do two things in the seminar, that one of them was that you wanted to determine whether where and whether Aristotle and Rousseau agreed or disagreed. In other words, you wanted to really explicate the text and make sure they understood what was there. Right. My first question is that then when you're dealing with that kind of explanation, an answer can be correct or incorrect. Mm-hmm. The second thing that you said that you wanted to do in the seminar was to have students to think about whether what a given author has said is true or whether it's false. When you're dealing with that kind of an issue, you know, the truth of an author, the falseness of what a premise is, then how do you evaluate an answer?
Well, as a matter of fact, that seminar took so much time on the first side, I should have said, with whom do Aristotle and Rousseau disagree about natural slaves? With whom do you agree? I think I almost didn't do it because I was pretty sure they'd all say they agree with Rousseau. I think they all would have said that. That they thought that Rousseau was right and Aristotle was wrong about natural slavery. Though I must say, when I've done that in some seminars, I've had some senior citizens in this country who are not inclined to believe in human equality, think that women are inferior, that there are natural slaves. I've gotten that. Question?
No, I think the point, I'd like to pick up on what Martha is saying, and this, I think, is part, to me, of evaluating the process of this, of the seminars. And also, as a classroom teacher of more years than I want to admit, looking at what is in the classroom, what we deal with students and different abilities of students. And to me, I see these works of our famous masters, famous ideas, whatever you want to call them, as something, and I'm going back to something I said yesterday too, Dr. Adler, that they're continuing ideas in history. There's a historical line, you know, Rousseau, we can see his influence in America. We see an impact that all of these writers have had in current history. But I don't think the students see that sometimes. And I would like very much to see in the process of the seminar, I guess personally, that we connect with the kids. I think those kids who are sitting in these corners, for example, the ones that may be listening well, we don't really know. I mean, kid can stare you in the eyes and you think they understand, and they may not be listening.
That's one of the reasons why I'd have them all do a piece of writing.
Right.
I wouldn't let, see, you can't tell, you're quite right. But then say, now you write an account of what you understood that seminar to do.
All right, but my point is, if you bring it to something that's current, that's something they can relate to today.
We did it. Look,
I know, but I think it could be done more, is what I'm saying.
You don't want to do it, you don't want to press it. You want to, if it comes out naturally, let it come out. But we got the distinction about the fact that democracy is very recent in the United States, women's suffrage, the abolition. We made the points toward the end that came out naturally in terms of that distinction between republic and democracy, and between nurture and nature, about the emancipation of women in the 20th century that didn't exist before. Those came out naturally, but you never, I think, never make the seminar serve the purpose of being current events.
Suppose that someone said, you may have seminars once a week in this high school, the only stipulation being that you must assign students a grade.
I wouldn't do it.
How would you tackle that? What would you do with it?
I would say At the end of the year, suppose I had them for a year. At the end of the year, what I'd like to have is someone other than me. This would require a group of 2 or 3 other teachers give each student an hour's oral examination about the books read. And then I'd say to them, I want you to tell me what you think of that child's understanding, that youngster's understanding of the discussions that he've been through. I don't want to grade it. I mean, I don't think grade is, was it poor, fair, mediocre, good, excellent? That's all I want. Just some kind of a sense of, there's no written examination that would do it for me. And the reason why I don't want to do it, I wouldn't want to do it myself, is that I would bring to it too much knowledge of the child from the seminars, you see. I'd like someone who was not in the seminars conduct the oral examination, who knew what the books were, and simply said, you've read Aristotle, tell me what you think about it. In other words, the person who gave the oral would have the list of readings, and they would ask and they might ask questions that never even were raised in the class, in the seminars. But that would be a measure of what had happened in the course of the year. I think that'd be the only evaluation I'd know. Now, that isn't, I'm sorry, that is not quite the full answer. Because the children around that table are not equal in their capacity. And my principle is that each one should be regarded as excellent if he does as much as his or her capacity permits. Therefore, you have to have some prior sense of their capacities to know what's happened in the course of the year.
I think it's incumbent upon us to realize that we're looking at one part of your approach in isolation. And I keep criticizing myself with that in mind. This may have happened on Wednesday with this group of youngsters. However, on Tuesday or Thursday, you may have dealt with some of these other issues.
With other books.
Or this very same topic in terms of having them to write. So I think we do have to be careful that this is not all that happens about Rousseau and the social contract right here on the spot. You could have compensated or items that were missed today could be picked up in your lecture, on your test.
Or a test, or in a piece of writing, or an oral discussion.
Let's take the example. I think it's a fear that everyone has. Over a period of time, a larger and larger percentage of your seminar class arrives on the scene without having read the text. Now, what do you do with that?
That's a disciplinary problem, isn't it?
Yeah.
My rule is those who have not read the text should keep their mouths shut, unless the question is one that anyone can address without having read the text. Now, if most of the class have not read the text, you can't conduct the seminar. The more natural, the more usual occasion is that more than half have and less than half haven't. Under those circumstances, when you discover that, you say, those of you who haven't read the text, please sit by quietly until a question not involving the text is raised to which you can engage in the discussion. You don't want them to do what they can't do, but sometimes the text will lead to a general question, as it did yesterday, about whether or not evil can befall a good man. Then they can get involved in the discussion, you see. But in general, you want to... I haven't had that experience very often.
No, and certainly you wouldn't, as these youngsters obviously are very prepared. But I think what the average teacher who may watch this tape will say, one seminar a week, I'm talking about 36 a year. Now, last week, less than half my youngsters read the assignment for our class discussion. What would lead me to believe that next year, all of a sudden, their behavior will change, and they will, in fact, read in depth week after week? I think that's a fear that they have.
I understand that. I don't know, I mean, I don't know that I have an answer to that question.
That's why grades continue to come into the picture, because certainly youngsters recognize grades as rewards, and sometimes it is a stick, if you will, that must be used.
I think I'm now speaking off the cuff, and I'm not sure what I'm saying is right. One thing to do is to say, who has not read the book for this occasion? 5 hands go up. You're excused. The rule being that when you've been excused from 3 seminars in the course of the year, you flunk.
Yeah.
Simple as that.
You've got to develop something
Something
there,
like
I think,
that. I mean,
to have that sort of motivation.
You have to have some kind of
That's right.
club.
You would like to assume that all learners come with the same motivation, but unfortunately that's not
You have to do something like that. That seems all right. You don't want to spoil the seminar for the others by having them participate when they haven't read. And you want to motivate them to read. Now, I think the best motivation is, and yesterday was better than the day for that, but today was harder, tomorrow will be much better, and so will Friday, is if they enjoy it. If they enjoy it, they'll read and take part.
Yes.
I mean, that's the club is, the carrot's much better than the stick.
Absolutely.
And you want them to read them as little as possible, as well as possible. The more you ask them to read, the more danger they'll read it poorly.
That's what I was struck by, that you were defining what reading is.
Yeah.
And if they understand that, in other words, I think they still believe that reading is just pronouncing the words.
Oh, no.
They should learn.
They're learning to read every minute of this seminar.
Well, I hope they understand that, because that's what struck me completely today, because you were basically testing them on their reading
That's
ability.
right, precisely. A seminar is always an exercise in reading. And I don't know any other way of teaching reading. I mean, when I say reading isn't taught in our schools, I mean seminars aren't conducted. The only way you can teach reading is this way.
That's right.
This is the teaching of reading.
That's why it's so wonderful.